I want to start by telling you something that took me a long time to say out loud. I almost died twice in the same week. The first time was in the hospital bed, when both of my kidneys were failing, and the doctors were using words like asterisk critical and dialysis, and we need to move quickly on this. The second time was when my daughter-in-law walked into that same hospital room, threw a stack of legal papers onto my lap, and demanded that I sign over my entire life savings, every single dollar I had set aside to keep myself alive, to her mother. When I said no, she picked up the blood pressure monitor mounted on the wall beside my bed and smashed it into the side of my head. I was 74 years old. I was lying in a hospital gown with IV lines running into both arms. My kidneys were failing. The machines beside me were doing half the work my body could no longer manage on its own. And the woman my son had chosen to build his life with stood over me in that sterile room, chest heaving, eyes wild with something I can only describe as the fury of a person who had already spent money they had not yet stolen. She believed I was dying. She had calculated, carefully and deliberately, that I would not survive long enough to fight back. She was wrong about that. She was wrong about a great many things. I pressed the emergency call button beside my pillow, held it down with a steady hand, and what unfolded in the minutes, weeks, and months that followed changed everything. For her, for my son, for the woman who had sent her on that errand, for the $320,000 she thought was already as good as hers. And for me. My name is Eugenia Mee Whitmore. Most people who know me well call me Jean. I am 74 years old. I spent 31 years teaching high school chemistry in Asheville, North Carolina, and then another 9 years after retirement tutoring students privately out of the sunroom of the house my late husband Clarence and I built together in 1987. I have lived in that house for 37 years. I know every creak in the floorboards, every draft in winter, every place where the afternoon light falls just right through the old glass windows. I tell you what kind of woman I am before I tell you what was done to me, because the kind of woman you are determines the kind of story you get to tell at the end of it. I am patient, I am methodical. I spent 3 decades teaching young people that chemistry is not magic. It is process. It is observation. It is controlling your conditions carefully, recording your data honestly, and never, under any circumstances, jumping to a conclusion before the evidence is complete. That discipline saved my life in that hospital room. Not dramatically, not heroically. It saved my life the way it has always saved me, quietly, through preparation, and through the refusal to panic when the pressure peaks. I did not panic, I pressed the button. But before I take you into that hospital room, I need to take you back to where this story truly begins, because nothing that happened to me on that Tuesday afternoon in November arrived without years of careful construction beneath it. Structures don't collapse without foundation failures. That is also chemistry. That is also true. Clarence Whitmore died 6 years ago from a stroke. He was 70 years old. He walked 3 miles every morning before the neighborhood woke up. He kept a vegetable garden in the backyard that produced more tomatoes than 2 people could ever reasonably eat. He had the blood pressure of a much younger man and had never spent a single night in a hospital as an adult patient until the night that became his last. The first symptom appeared on a Thursday morning. He said he had a headache behind his left eye. I told him to drink water and rest. By Thursday evening, he could not form complete sentences. By Friday morning, the paramedics were in our bedroom. By Saturday night, Clarence was gone, and the house we had built together became a place where I had to learn, from the beginning, how to exist as a singular person after 43 years of being part of a pair. Grief is its own kind of chemistry. It changes the composition of everything it touches. Robert was 40 years old when his father died. He drove from Charlotte the moment I called him, and he stayed for 2 weeks, and he was everything a son should be in those first terrible days. He handled the funeral arrangements, the legal paperwork, the well-meaning visitors who filled our living room with casseroles and gentle murmuring. He held my hand through the burial and did not let go until I told him I was all right, which was not entirely true, but was true enough to function. After those 2 weeks, he went back to Charlotte, back to his job, back to his life, which was exactly right and exactly as it should have been. I would not have wanted him to diminish his life to manage my grief. Clarence would not have wanted that either. What I did not anticipate, in those early months of widowhood, was how thoroughly the silence would change my judgment about certain things. I had always been a self-sufficient woman. 31 years of managing a classroom full of teenagers who were convinced they knew better than everyone taught me to rely on myself, to make decisions from evidence rather than emotion, to set boundaries with confidence and enforce them without apology. These were not qualities that dissolved when Clarence died. But loneliness has a particular effect on even the most self-sufficient person. It does not remove your judgment. It simply makes you more willing to pay a certain price for connection. And when you are willing to pay, there are always people who are willing to charge. Robert and Sandra had been married for 2 years when Clarence died. I had known Sandra for 3 years at that point, and in those early years I found her genuinely likable. She was sharp and organized in the way that competent people are, with opinions she was not shy about expressing and an energy that filled a room in a way I found, at the time, refreshing. She asked about my teaching. She was curious about chemistry, or performed curiosity convincingly enough that I couldn't distinguish it from the real thing. She remembered things I told her and brought them up later, which is a particular skill that either indicates genuine interest or sophisticated social calculation, and for a long time I chose to believe it was the former. She was devoted to her mother, Miriam Park, which I respected. The bond between a daughter and her mother is not a thing I would minimize or view with suspicion. I had been close to my own mother until her death. I understood devotion. What I did not immediately understand was how devotion can function as a delivery mechanism for something else entirely. Miriam Park was 67 years old when she became a recurring presence in my financial life. She lived in a rental apartment in Greenville, South Carolina, approximately 2 hours south of Asheville. She was a woman who had retired early from a clerical position with a pension that was modest and a savings history that was nearly non-existent. She had made a series of decisions over the years that had compounded her financial fragility: a failed investment in a cousin's restaurant venture, several years of living somewhat beyond what her pension could sustain, a vehicle purchase that exceeded her means. None of these decisions were catastrophic in isolation, but together they produced a woman in a state of perpetual near-crisis. Sandra bore the emotional weight of her mother's situation with a visible heaviness that I initially found touching. She spoke of Miriam the way you speak of someone whose suffering you feel personally, which is different from simply worrying about a parent. It is a specific kind of weight, and it was real. I don't question that it was real. The first request came approximately 2 years into Robert and Sandra's marriage, during a Sunday dinner at my house. It was casual, embedded in a larger conversation about Miriam's situation, the way large asks are sometimes embedded in context to make them seem smaller. Sandra mentioned that Miriam needed a reliable car, that her current vehicle had broken down twice, that it was a safety issue for a woman living alone. She mentioned a figure: $11,000 for a solid used car. Robert looked at me. I did not say yes or no at the table. I told them I would think about it, which I did for exactly 2 days, which is my standard interval for financial decisions of any size. Then I called Robert and told him I would contribute $4,000 toward a reliable vehicle for Miriam, and that the balance was between him and Sandra and their own household budget. Robert thanked me. Sandra called within the hour, warm and grateful. Miriam sent a handwritten card. That was the door opening. I did not hear it open. I heard it only in retrospect, which is true of most doors that matter. Over the following 3 years, the requests developed a rhythm and a trajectory. A medical procedure Miriam's insurance did not fully cover. A dental situation that required urgent attention. 6 months of help with rent when her landlord raised it substantially. An emergency car repair. A trip to visit an ailing relative that Sandra framed as important for her mother's emotional health after a difficult year. Each time I gave something, sometimes less than they hoped, sometimes more than I strictly should have. And each time, there was gratitude. There was warmth. There was Sandra calling me in the days after with the particular tone of a woman who feels seen and supported. And because I am a widow living alone in a large house on a quiet street, that tone meant more to me than I would like to admit. I was buying something. I understood that, on the level of self-knowledge that you are able to sustain when you are also simultaneously motivated not to look too directly at an uncomfortable truth. I was buying closeness. I was buying the sense of being needed and appreciated. I was buying the warmth that came with Robert and Sandra's visits, the noise of children in the hallway, the smell of someone else's cooking in my kitchen. Loneliness is expensive, not always in money, but sometimes in money. I want to be honest about my own part in this, because the story is not solely about what was done to me. It is also about what I allowed, and for how long, and what I told myself that made the allowing possible. I owe you that honesty because it is the part of the story that is actually useful, that might reach someone watching this who is in the early chapters of a similar narrative and has not yet seen where it leads. The small contributions became medium contributions. The medium contributions became an expectation. The expectation became so embedded in the architecture of our family dynamic that at a certain point, the absence of a contribution would have required an explanation, while the presence of one required nothing. It simply was. I was simply someone who helped when Miriam needed help, the way gravity simply pulls things downward. No one thanks gravity. No one considers whether gravity might prefer a different arrangement. I had become a financial law of nature in their lives. And they had made certain, carefully and without ever saying so directly, that I understood my role. The total, accumulated across 4.5 years of this pattern, was something I calculated one evening in my kitchen with a legal pad and my reading glasses and a cup of tea that went cold before I finished. Not counting my ongoing living expenses, not counting my pension or my house, the amount I had directed toward Miriam's needs and toward Sandra's various requests related to her mother came to just over $47,000. I sat with that number for a long time. Then I looked at my savings account balance, which was $320,000, and I thought about Clarence, and about every Saturday morning at the kitchen table when we would review our finances together, the two of us, careful and deliberate, making sure the numbers were right, making sure the future was provisioned for, making sure that when the body finally presented its inevitable bill, we would be in a position to pay it with dignity. $320,000, that was the number, that was the line. And something told me, sitting at that kitchen table with my cold tea and my legal pad, that someone else had looked at that number and was thinking about it differently than I was. I could not have told you why I felt it. It was not evidence-based, not yet. It was the kind of cellular intuition that a 73-year-old woman develops after a lifetime of paying attention to the patterns of human behavior. Something had shifted in the atmosphere around my money, and I could feel it the way you feel weather changing before the barometer confirms it. I was right, I just didn't yet know how right. The kidney problems announced themselves the way serious illness often does, not with a single dramatic moment, but with an accumulation of symptoms that individually seem explicable and collectively constitute a crisis. Fatigue I attributed to my age, swelling in my ankles and feet that I blamed on the summer heat, a low-grade nausea that arrived in the mornings and that I had decided was related to a new brand of vitamins I was taking. I am a chemistry teacher. I am a woman who believes in data and evidence. And yet, I had been constructing alternative explanations for my body's signals for over a year, which tells you something about how effectively the mind protects itself from information it is not ready to receive. My primary care physician caught it during a routine blood panel. She called me on a Thursday afternoon with that particular quality of professional calm that communicates urgency without causing immediate panic. She said my creatinine numbers were significantly elevated. She said she was referring me immediately to a nephrologist. She said I should not delay the appointment. I did not delay. Dr. Anya Osei was a small, precise woman who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain, and had the manner of someone who had delivered difficult news enough times to have found a language for it that was honest without being theatrical. She sat across from me in her office on a Tuesday morning and told me that I was in stage 4 chronic kidney disease, that the trajectory without aggressive intervention was toward complete renal failure within 12 to 18 months, and that the treatment plan would require significant resources, significant commitment, and significant ongoing monitoring. I asked her, before she could continue, what significant resources meant in specific terms. She told me the numbers were large. My insurance would cover a meaningful portion, but not all. The gap was substantial and growing more substantial as the treatment plan evolved. I drove home from that appointment and sat in Clarence's armchair in the living room, the brown leather chair that still held, I sometimes imagined, the faint impression of the shape of him, and I did what I have always done with difficult information. I held it carefully. I turned it over. I looked at it from every direction without flinching. And then I made my plan. The plan was straightforward. My $320,000 existed precisely for this moment. It was treatment money. It had always been treatment money, even before I needed it for treatment, because Clarence and I had always understood that the purpose of savings is not preservation for its own sake, but provision for the moments when your life requires more than your income can supply. This was that moment. The money would do what it had been saved to do. I called Robert that evening. He came that weekend, driving from Charlotte on Saturday morning, arriving before noon. He sat at my kitchen table in the chair across from mine, the chair where Clarence used to sit, and he listened to everything I told him. His face moved through several expressions, fear and grief and love, and the particular helplessness of a child confronting a parent's mortality in concrete terms, and I let all of those expressions happen without trying to manage them. He needed to feel them. I needed him to feel them. When I finished explaining the diagnosis and the treatment plan and the financial picture, he said, "Mom, whatever you need. Whatever I can do." I told him what I needed was for him to trust that I had this in hand, that my finances were structured appropriately. That Francis Aldridge, my attorney, had reviewed my documents and everything was current and clear. That the savings were adequate to the purpose they had been saved for, and that the purpose was now actively required. He nodded. He said he understood. Then he said Sandra sent her love and was sorry she couldn't be there. That Bria had a school commitment. I said that was perfectly fine. Something moved in his face that I noticed and then set aside, the way you set aside a piece of data that doesn't yet fit the pattern you're building. Treatment began in September. Dr. Osai's team was thorough and direct, two qualities I find essential in medical professionals and in people generally. The medication protocol began showing early signs of effect within the first 6 weeks, though my numbers remained serious and the margin for error remained narrow. I adjusted my diet, eliminated certain foods, incorporated others, tracked my fluid intake with the same precision I had once applied to laboratory measurements. I managed. That is the particular grammar of serious illness. You don't recover dramatically and you don't decline steadily. You manage day by day, measurement by measurement, making small adjustments and hoping the aggregate moves in the right direction. Robert called every 3 days. He visited twice in October, drove me to 2 appointments, helped me reorganize the kitchen so that my dietary requirements were easier to maintain. He brought me audiobooks, which I had never been interested in before and discovered I loved during the long, still evenings when reading was difficult and television felt like an intrusion. Sandra called once in October. She texted several times, brief messages with enthusiastic punctuation that communicated the minimum amount of information necessary to qualify as contact. In the meantime, I had a conversation with Francis Aldridge that I have thought about many times since. I had called Francis to confirm that my advance directive and medical power of attorney were current, which they were. At the end of the call, Francis said something she had not been prompted to say, and that she delivered with the careful phrasing of a woman who has 30 years of experience in knowing when to say things and how. She said, "Jean, I want to mention something, not because I have specific cause for concern, but because I've been doing this work long enough to know that certain situations carry certain risks. When someone in your position, a woman with significant assets who is visibly unwell, there can be a shift in the behavior of people around them. Financial interests that weren't visible before can become visible. I'm not pointing to anything specific. I'm suggesting that you be attentive, document everything, and call me immediately if anything feels wrong." I thanked her and told her I would. I thought about that conversation for the rest of October. The hospitalization came in early November. My kidney function declined sharply over 3 days. a drop that Dr. Osai later described as steep, but not unprecedented given the nature of my condition and the particular demands of the seasonal transition. My body, she said, was simply communicating that the management phase had shifted into crisis territory. Beverly, my neighbor of 22 years, found me on a Wednesday morning when I did not answer her knock for our usual morning coffee. She said later that she knew the moment she saw my face through the window. She called 911 before she had finished unlocking my front door with the spare key I had given her. I was admitted to Asheville Regional Medical Center within the hour. IV lines in both arms, monitoring equipment on every available surface. A room on the third floor with a window that looked out over the parking garage and a sliver of the mountain ridge beyond it. Robert arrived Wednesday evening. He looked frightened in a way he was trying very hard not to perform, which I found more genuine than if he had been less controlled. He held my hand and did not say much, which was exactly right. Dr. Ose came Thursday morning and spoke with both of us about the treatment adjustments and the immediate priorities. She said the next several days were critical. She said she was cautiously optimistic, but wanted me to understand the seriousness of the situation clearly. I told her I appreciated directness. She said she had heard that about me. Robert stayed Thursday night, sleeping in the recliner chair in the corner that no one has ever found comfortable, but that every family member in every hospital room across the country uses anyway because the alternative is leaving. I woke at 3 in the morning and watched him sleep, the way I had watched him sleep when he was 7 years old and had moved into our bed after a thunderstorm, and I felt the weight of loving someone so completely and so helplessly that their suffering is inseparable from yours. He left Friday morning. Work obligations he could not defer. He kissed my forehead and told me he loved me and told me not to worry, which is what people say when they need you to be fine more than they need you to be honest about not being fine. I told him I would see him Sunday. Sandra arrived Friday afternoon. I want to describe the next 45 minutes with precision, because precision is how I honor what happened, and because the details are what distinguish the truth from the version she would have preferred. She came in at approximately 2:30. I know because I had just finished the interaction with the physical therapist who came by each afternoon, and I had looked at the clock when she left, and it was 2:22 when Sandra appeared in the doorway. She was dressed as if she had come from a professional environment. Navy blazer, dark trousers, a silk blouse in a muted print, her hair was arranged and her makeup was composed. She looked, in other words, like someone who had made a deliberate decision about how they wanted to appear for a specific occasion. She was carrying a manila folder. She closed the door behind her. She did not embrace me. She did not say, "How are you feeling?" She did not say, "I'm sorry I couldn't get here sooner." She pulled the chair to the edge of my bed, sat down, and opened the folder on her lap. "Jean asterisk," she said, "I need to talk to you about something important, and I need you to really hear me." I said, "All right." She placed the documents on my lap, on top of the hospital blanket, over my legs where the IV lines ran into my arms. A stack of papers, perhaps 8 or 10 pages, the top sheet bearing language I recognized from years of estate planning and financial management as the general format of a financial transfer document. She said, "Robert and I have been discussing your situation very carefully. Given how serious things have become, we believe your savings should be moved into a more protected position immediately. My mother is prepared to serve as a trustee and hold the funds safely on your behalf. It's just a precaution, until you're stable and able to manage things yourself." I looked at the papers. I looked at her. "Sandra," I said, "these are transfer documents. It's a protective trust arrangement. These transfer my savings to your mother. For your protection asterisk," she said. "In case something happens and you're not in a position to manage your own finances, we want to make sure the money is safe." "My money is safe," I said. "It is in a federally insured account. My advance directive is current. My medical power of attorney is assigned to my attorney, Francis Aldridge, as it has been for 4 years. None of these documents are legally necessary, and none of them reflect any arrangement I have agreed to." Her composure thinned, not dramatically, a degree or two, like watching ice begin to develop surface cracks while the structure below is still holding. Jean, we're trying to protect you. You're trying to transfer $320,000 to your mother while I am incapacitated in a hospital bed, I said. I would like you to remove those papers from my lap. Robert agrees with this plan. Then he can tell me so when he visits Sunday. He doesn't want to upset you. He thought it would be easier coming from me. I held her gaze. Nothing about this is easy, Sandra. Take the papers. She stood. She gathered the documents from my lap with a sharp, controlled movement. She held the folder against her chest and looked at me with an expression I had not seen on her face before, not in 7 years of Sunday dinners and holiday visits and careful, performed warmth. It was the expression of a woman who has been patient for a very long time and has just run out of patience entirely. You are being stubborn, she said. Your condition affects your judgment, the doctor said. Dr. Ose has made no statement about my cognitive capacity, asterisk, I said. And if you wish to challenge my legal competency, you will need to do that through Frances Aldridge's office. I'll give you her direct number if you need it. Jean, I will not be signing anything today, or any other day that involves your mother receiving my money. This conversation is finished. I have thought since that day about what tips a person over the edge of what they had planned. Sandra had come with documents. She had a script. She had probably rehearsed it, perhaps with Miriam on the phone the night before, or in the car on the drive up from Charlotte. She had expected resistance and had probably prepared responses to that resistance. What she had not prepared for, I think, was the complete absence of fear in my voice. I was not afraid of her. I had not been afraid of anything since I pressed Clarence's cold hand in a hospital room 6 years ago and understood that the worst thing I could ever experience had already arrived and I had survived it. There was nothing Sandra Park-Whitmore could do to me that would constitute the worst thing. She reached to the side of my bed. She grabbed the blood pressure monitor where it was mounted on its wall bracket, a piece of equipment perhaps the size and weight of a large hardcover book, and she pulled it from the mounting in one hard, decisive movement. And she brought it down against the left side of my head. I will tell you what that moment felt like, not for dramatic effect, but because the specific quality of an experience like that is information. There was an impact, a sharp concussive force above my left ear, followed immediately by a burst of white light and a high ringing in my left ear. My head was knocked sideways against the pillow. I tasted something metallic. The ringing was very loud. And then, beneath the ringing, was a clarity I did not expect. Not calm exactly, something more specific than calm. The precision that extreme moments sometimes produce in people who have spent their lives cultivating precision. I knew exactly what had happened. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I knew exactly what the camera in the upper corner of the room near the door had just recorded. I had noticed that camera on Wednesday when I was admitted. I am a woman who notices things. I pressed the emergency call button with my right hand, steadily, without hesitation, and I held it down. I also turned my face toward the camera, deliberately, not dramatically, simply so that whatever had happened to my face in the last 45 seconds would be captured clearly by the lens that I knew was recording. The response took less than 30 seconds. A nurse, Delia, came through the door first, moving quickly. A second nurse was directly behind her. A hospital security officer who had been monitoring the call station came in immediately after. They took in the scene, and I watched them take it in, me against the pillow with something warm and wet running down the side of my face, Sandra standing at the foot of the bed with the blood pressure monitor still in her hand. The security officer said, calmly and with authority, "Ma'am, put that down." Sandra put it down. That was the last decision she made freely in that room. Delia pressed a clean cloth against my temple with careful hands and spoke to me quietly, asking me to stay with her, asking me if I could tell her my name and what day it was. I told her my name was Eugenia Whitmore, that it was a Friday in November, and that I would like someone to call the police. My voice was steady. The ringing in my ear was still loud, but it was beginning to thin. Already done, the security officer said. They're on their way. I looked at Sandra. She was standing near the window, and her face had undergone a recalibration that I recognized from 31 years of watching students, realize the consequences of an irreversible decision. The particular expression of someone whose internal calculation has just produced a result they did not anticipate. The police arrived in 11 minutes. I know because I watch the clock on the wall and because I track things, always have. 2 officers interviewed Sandra in the hallway. I could not hear the conversation, but I could see it through the window in the room's door, and I watched the progression of it with the attention I had once given to a slow chemical reaction observed through safety glass. I watched Sandra speak, and I watched the officers' expressions remain carefully neutral, and I watched Sandra speak more, and I watched one officer write steadily in a notebook, and I watched Sandra's posture change from confident to contained to diminished across the span of perhaps 8 minutes. Because the camera had recorded everything. Not partial footage, not ambiguous footage. Complete, unobstructed footage of Sandra placing papers on my lap, of me declining to sign them, of the monitor being pulled from the wall, of the impact, of my hand pressing the call button. All of it, from beginning to end. In a well-lit hospital room with a camera that, as the security officer later confirmed to me, was high resolution and functioning perfectly. One of the officers came into my room when the medical staff had finished their initial assessment. He asked me if I wanted to make a statement. I said yes. He asked if I was able to do so. I said yes. He asked if I needed to wait for medical clearance. I looked at Delia. She said I had a laceration that had been dressed, and that the on-call physician wanted to do a head CT as a precaution given my existing medical situation, but that I was coherent and capable of speaking. I gave my statement, calmly, chronologically, precisely, every detail I have told you in the same order I have told it, without embellishment and without minimization. The officer thanked me and told me that given the footage and my statement, they would be filing charges. I thanked him and told him that was the correct decision. Robert arrived at the hospital at 6:15 that evening. Someone had reached him. I don't know whether it was the hospital staff or Sandra or the police, and I have not asked because it doesn't matter. He came through the door of my room and stopped when he saw the bandaging on the left side of my head, and the expression on his face was one of the most painful things I have witnessed in recent years, because it was not merely shock. It was the expression of a man absorbing the weight of what he had allowed to grow in his own household. He crossed the room and knelt beside the bed and said my name, and I let him hold my hand for a moment before I told him to sit down. He sat. I asked him directly whether he had agreed to Sandra's plan to transfer my savings to her mother. He told me he had known Sandra wanted to talk to me about a financial protection arrangement, that he had not known the specifics, that he had not agreed to a transfer, that he had not known about the documents. I asked him whether he had told her not to pursue it. The pause before his answer contained more information than the answer itself. He said he had known Sandra was worried about my finances and what would happen if my condition worsened. That he hadn't known what form the conversation would take. That he had told himself it was Sandra's relationship with me to manage. I told him that choosing not to know is a form of knowing. That willful blindness is not the same as innocence, even though it sometimes feels similar from the inside. I told him that I had needed him to be present in this situation, and that he had made a choice, perhaps not consciously, perhaps not maliciously, but a choice nonetheless, to be absent in the most consequential way. He wept. I did not stop him. When he was steadier, I told him clearly and quietly what the conditions of our going forward would be. Sandra was not to come to my home. She was not to be given information about my health or my finances. If those conditions were unacceptable to him, I would understand it and grieve it, but I would not change them. He said they were acceptable. I told him I loved him. He told me the same. Then I told him to go get coffee because he looked exhausted, and I needed to rest before my CT scan. He laughed a little, the surprised laugh of someone who was not expecting normalcy in that moment, and that small laugh told me that we would find our way back to each other eventually. Not immediately, not without work, but eventually. The CT scan showed no significant injury beyond the laceration and soft tissue bruising. The on-call physician was thorough, and the results were, given the nature of the impact and my existing vulnerabilities, better than expected. My kidney treatment continued in the days that followed. Dr. Ose adjusted the protocol in response to the additional physiological stress of the assault. She told me, with the direct calm I had come to rely on, that my body was managing, and that managing was the objective. I was discharged 3 weeks after the assault, on a Tuesday morning in late November. Beverly picked me up. She held my arm on the way to the car and did not say anything about the bandage on my temple, which by then had been reduced to a small adhesive patch, and she drove me home with the particular quality of quiet that close friends deploy when they know the full story and understand that the story does not need to be retold. She made me tea when we got to my house. We sat in the kitchen, in the same chairs where Clarence and I had sat on hundreds of Saturday mornings, and she looked at me across the table and said, "You did exactly right." I said, "I know." She said, "Are you really all right?" I thought about that honestly. "I'm more all right than I expected to be," I said, which is perhaps its own kind of answer. She stayed for 2 hours and then went home, and I was alone in my house for the first time since the hospitalization, and the quiet felt different than it had before. Not smaller, larger. The quiet of a space that belongs to you completely because you have defended it. In the weeks that followed, the legal process moved with the particular rhythm of institutional accountability, which is slower than anger wants but more durable than emotion. Sandra was charged with assault causing bodily harm. Her attorney entered a not guilty plea. The footage from the hospital camera was submitted to the prosecutor's office. Frances Aldridge connected me with a victim advocacy coordinator who helped me understand the process and my role within it. I gave a formal statement to the prosecutor's office in December, seated in a conference room with Frances beside me, and I delivered it with the same calm precision with which I had given the initial statement to the officers at the hospital. The footage, the prosecutor told Frances, was unambiguous. I did not feel vindictive about that. I felt accurate. Miriam Park was not charged. The evidence did not support criminal charges against her personally, and while I understand that she had been involved in the planning, the law requires a higher threshold than involvement. I accept that. Justice and the legal system are not synonymous, and I have lived long enough to make peace with that distinction. What Miriam lost, without any legal intervention, was the access she had been cultivating for years. The proximity to my finances, the channel through which she had been drawing resources, the daughter whose marriage was now fracturing under the weight of what they had planned together. Some things carry their own consequence without needing a courtroom to administer it. Robert began the process of separating from Sandra in January. This is not something I celebrate. A marriage ending is not a victory. It is a wound on a family, especially on children who had no part in the choices that caused it. Robert's children from his first marriage, the teenagers I adore, had to absorb another disruption. That cost is real, and I hold it carefully. But Robert was also, slowly and genuinely, becoming someone I recognized again. He called every other day. He came to Asheville every other week. He sat with me through 2 medical appointments in January and asked intelligent questions of Dr. Osai and followed up on the answers, the way Clarence used to, with the attention of someone who is investing in an outcome rather than performing concern. At one of those appointments, Dr. Ose told me my numbers had stabilized more significantly than she had projected at the beginning of treatment. She said the word *encouraged, which is not a word she uses easily and which landed on me like sunlight on a cold morning. I told her I had things to do. She said she believed that. In December, a few weeks after I came home from the hospital, I went into the sunroom on a Friday afternoon and opened the botanical illustration kit I had not touched in 11 years. The brushes were stiffer than they used to be. The colors in the small paint wells had dried at the edges and needed reconstituting with careful amounts of water. My hands, when I first picked up the finest brush, were not steady in the way they had once been. But they were steadier than I expected. The body, I have learned, remembers things the mind has stored as lost. I sat at the drafting table with the winter light coming through the old glass, and I drew a kidney. Not because it was a beautiful subject, though I find beauty in functional structures that most people overlook. Because it was mine. Because it was the thing that had nearly failed and had not failed, the organ that had brought me to that hospital room and to that moment with that monitor and to the pressing of that button. I drew it in cross-section. I rendered the internal structures in careful ink lines, the branching architecture of the vessels, the intricate filtering systems. Then I painted it, deep reds and pale interior tissue, the colors that are the body's truth rather than its performance. Then, around the edges of the drawing, I added the other things. A coffee cup with steam curling upward, a bare rosebush with the suggestion of new growth at the tips, an open window, a clock face with hands set to exactly the time that I pressed the call button. Beverly looked at it when she came the following Tuesday and stood in front of it for a long time without speaking. "That's something, Jean asterisk," she finally said. "It's a kidney," I told her. "I know exactly what it is," she said, "and it's still something." I framed it. It hangs in the sunroom now, beside the window that looks out over Clarence's old vegetable garden, where the tomato plants will grow again in the spring if I have anything to say about it. And I do have something to say about it. I have a great deal to say about it. I am 74 years old, and I am not finished. I have been asked by the people who know this story whether I am angry. It is the question that arrives first, in various forms and with various levels of delicacy. Are you angry at Sandra, at Robert, at Miriam, at yourself for not drawing harder lines sooner? Here is my honest answer, and I give it not to seem noble, but because it is simply true. Anger is corrosive when it has nowhere to go. I have spent 31 years teaching teenagers about chemical reactions that consume their containers, and I know better than to choose that outcome for myself. What I carry instead of anger is something more like precision. A clear-eyed understanding of what happened and why, who made which choices and at which cost, and what the correct response to those choices is. The correct response was the emergency button. The correct response was Francis Aldridge. The correct response was a clear statement, given calmly, recorded completely. The correct response was telling Robert the conditions clearly and holding to them without negotiation. The correct response, now, is to continue. Continue treatment. Continue managing the numbers that require managing. Continue sitting at the kitchen table on the first of every month with tea and reading glasses and a careful accounting of my finances, which are intact, and which will fund the treatment they were always meant to fund, and which no one will redirect, because I am paying attention and I am documented and I know where the camera is. Continue painting. Continue having coffee with Beverly on weekday mornings. Continue being available to my grandchildren and to Robert as he works through what he needs to work through. Continue growing things in Clarence's garden, which produces more tomatoes than one person can reasonably eat and which I share with the neighbors, because that is what abundance is actually for. Here is what I want to say to anyone watching this who recognizes any piece of it, not the dramatic hospital room piece, the quieter pieces. The gradual erosion of limits you told yourself was generosity. The requests that came more frequently because you never found the firm way to stop them. The loneliness that made you confuse being needed with being valued. The moment when you understood that someone had been conducting a calculation about your mortality and had placed a bet on a particular outcome. You are allowed to press the button. Not only the emergency call button, though yes, always and immediately that, the other button. The one that summons Francis Aldridge. The one that gives your statement clearly and completely. The one that says to the people who depend on your silence that the silence has ended. The one that calls the people who love you honestly and tells them what the conditions are from here. You are allowed to protect what you spent a lifetime building. You are allowed to be the steward of your own resources and your own future. You are allowed to say no from a hospital bed, or a kitchen table, or a sunroom in the winter light, in whatever room the question finds you. You are allowed to be a woman who has survived the worst thing and who understands, because of that survival, that there is nothing left to be afraid of. I am 74 years old. My kidneys are still working. My money is still in my account. My son is finding his way back. My savings are doing exactly what Clarence and I saved them to do. And on Tuesday mornings, Beverly comes for coffee, and we sit in my kitchen, and the house is warm, and the painting hangs in the sunroom, and the garden will grow again in the spring. I press the button. I am still here. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. Everything presented here is a work of dramatic narrative storytelling, crafted for emotional impact, reflection, and meaningful conversation about the experiences of older adults, financial vulnerability, family dynamics, and the courage it takes to advocate for yourself when it matters most. We hope this story reminds you that your life, your resources, your dignity, and your future are worth protecting at every age and in every season. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs to hear it. You matter more than you know. Take good care of yourself.